Someone asked on Reddit, what was the scariest moment when you said, we have to go now? What do you think is the scariest story? Express your opinion in the comments. Store 1.
When we were teenagers, my sister and I were walking our dog in the local woods, very close to our childhood home. We were about to leave and had just shaved our dog again, when suddenly, a woman appeared and started chatting with us. She was strange. She said that her dog would like some socializing with our dog, and that we could come back with her for 5 minutes. What I didn't notice, but my sister noticed, was that her dog was nowhere to be seen. The woman was almost packing us up to head back into the woods when my sister saw a van out of the corner of her eye. I was still unaware at this point. Suddenly, my sister yells, "Dad!" And luckily for us, Dad had finished his work and went for a run. He starts waving and running towards us, and by the time we turn around, she has disappeared. My sister looks back in the van and sees the lady closing the passenger door and speeding away. The dog was still nowhere to be seen. I think we were minutes away from being kidnapped. It was divine intervention that my father was in the right place at the right time.
Store 2.
I stopped by a friend's house to watch a match. He and his wife and I were just relaxing, and someone knocked on the door. It was noon. He opened the door. He thought others might come. I heard him greet someone. It was his brother, whom I had never met before, but I had heard about him. He was a very suspicious-looking guy. Meth teeth, skinny, long, greasy hair. My friend told me he had a brother who lived in the area and had a serious substance problem. Buddy is talking idly with his brother, and he gets a call on his cell phone. Whoever called, he just tells them, "Not yet, I'll call you later." It's pretty clear that this guy came to rob and probably to destroy witnesses. I look at my friend. He seems to have come to the same conclusion. Now, my friend's wife is a woman who talks nonsense. Sweet but athletic. Tall. She left the room to go to the restroom, or so she says. She comes back in the room with some harmful device in her hand. I'm thinking, what nonsense have I gotten into? But she calmly says, "Ron, you're angry and you came here with bad intentions. You need to leave quietly. If you think of anything, their son Chris is sitting outside in his truck to make sure you leave." Ron doesn't say a word. He just turns and walks out the door. We can hear his old truck speeding away. Chris comes in and says, "He's gone. I don't think he's coming back." They ask me to leave so they can decide what to do. They have already called the police who know Ron well. The next morning, my friend called me and told me that the police had found his brother dead in the trailer park where he lived. They guessed that he was in serious debt and had come to rob his brother. I told my friend I was sorry, and he said, "Don't be."
Story 3.
I was 12 years old back then, and my favorite thing in the world was spending the night at my grandmother's house. We lived in the countryside, and my grandmother was closer to the nearest town. It was Thursday night, and it was my grandmother's night. One Thursday evening, I wasn't feeling well and asked my mom if I could stay home with her and my dad. They reluctantly agreed. I went home, watched some TV, and got into bed. My bedroom was on the wall next to the living room. I wasn't really asleep, but I heard my mom repeatedly saying my dad's name in a somewhat panicked tone. I quietly crept out to the living room, and my dad was slumped back on the couch, snoring very loudly. This wasn't unusual, but my mom was next to him, shaking him and telling him to wake up. She yelled at me to go back to bed. Honestly, I didn't do that. I quietly went to the bedrooms to call 911. I told the operator that my dad was asleep and that my mom was trying to wake him up but couldn't. Eventually, the call went to the living room and my mom talked to the dispatcher. They sent an ambulance to the middle of nowhere. My dad had taken a bottle of diazepam in an attempt to harm himself. I remember sitting on the floor, holding his hand, and repeatedly telling him that I loved him. The ambulance came and took him to the hospital. Lights and sirens all the way. At that time, we didn't know what was happening. But 1 or 2 days later, we found out. And that's when our world changed. If I hadn't called 911 that night, I'm pretty sure my dad would have succeeded. And my mom would have probably lost it too. And I don't know why I didn't want to spend the night at my grandmother's. I just felt like I needed to be home.
Story 4.
I was about 10 or 11 years old when I was invited to a sleepover. My mom didn't really like me going because I usually stayed up late and ended up cranky the next day. When she dropped me off, she gave me her usual parting words. "Just remember, if you want to come home, I'll come to get you. No matter what time it is, just call me." The sleepover itself was pretty typical. We watched a movie, gossiped, pulled some pranks on a few kids. This was before cell phones and caller ID, and played with a Ouija board. etc. It turned out that the girl hosting the sleepover had an older brother in high school, and he had some friends over too. I remember standing at the door of the room where we were having fun and feeling something chilling, thinking to myself, I want to go home. I went upstairs and told them I wanted to use the phone. I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. At first, her mom said no, scolding me for being a baby, but I kept insisting that I needed to call my mom and still felt that I needed to leave. Eventually, I was allowed to use the phone, and my mom came to pick me up and we stopped at Dairy Queen on the way home. My mom was always that cool, and I still remember the great feeling of relief when I climbed into the car. Years later, I learned that the older brother and his friends had harassed some of the girls during the sleepover. Nobody had reported it at the time, and I think it took years for any of the girls to compare notes and realize that they weren't the only ones it had happened to. I'm sad that it happened to them, but I'm glad I listened to my instincts and got out of there.
Story 5.
In 2019, me, my wife, and 2 daughters, ages 6 and 9, were on a road trip in the South. We booked an apartment in Atlanta through Airbnb, not knowing the neighborhood at all. It was bad. There were a lot of creepy-looking people walking around. When we walked into the apartment, my 6-year-old immediately said, I don't like it here. The door didn't lock properly. The beds were dirty, there was rotting food in the fridge, and the bathroom had not been cleaned for a long time. My wife called the landlord, who refused to give us a refund. To defuse the situation, my wife offered not to leave a negative review if we could get our money back. The landlord agreed, but asked us to wait for him so they could speak in person. As soon as I hung up the phone, I told my wife that we had to leave immediately. We ran to the car, and when we came out of the parking lot, we saw the landlord coming with 4 of his friends. He didn't see us, and we ran out of there. We stayed in a hotel on the 14th floor. We didn't feel safe even at street level.
Story 6.
When my little sister and I were kids, we went camping in a forest very close to our home. We saw a bald man in a blue shirt walking around with a dog, which wasn't unusual for the area. You often come across people walking by who say hello, but for some reason, I felt a tightness in my chest, and my sister must have felt it too, because we exchanged a look. I don't know what made me do it. It's not like me at all. But as we walked away, I took a picture of his back. After a while, we saw the same man again near the lake. He approached us and asked about the tent we were carrying, where we would be setting it up, and if we were camping with our dad. We lied and said we would see him soon. We must have had the same instinct because we walked down the path until we reached a fork, then looked at each other and jumped onto a path hidden by bushes, waiting behind them for a while. The man watched us walk away, pretending to play with his dog until he couldn't see us anymore. Then he turned around and ran down the path behind us. Luckily, he didn't see us hiding and continued straight from where he thought we had gone. We decided that camping was a bad idea and went home. That evening, my mom showed us a post from a local residents group that had a picture of the same bald man trying to get into someone's house. Apparently, he was just wandering around trying people's front doors and claimed to be a repairman when he was confronted. I'm scared to think about what his intentions were, but my sister and I knew that forest very well, so we were really lucky. Otherwise, we might have considered going down one of those hidden paths.
Story 7.
Wednesday midday, run along a beautiful river pathway near my apartment block. About 1 kilometer in, I felt people watching me and directly turned around and ran home, even though I did not see anybody. Closed the 2 magnetic gates leading up to my door and didn't see anybody around or follow me. About 10 minutes later, 2 guys were at my front door trying to push it in. I was luckily on the other side of the door at that moment and pushed it back closed with all my force and began screaming. I managed to security lock the front door and text my apartment block for help. I was on the 2nd floor, and they obviously watched which apartment I went into. Looking back at the apartment's security cameras, they were able to see the 2 guys pull apart the magnetic security gates. 2 of them. The block then quickly changed the gates to a mechanic lock that cannot be pulled apart.
Story 8.
Sitting in my friend's backyard with their 2 kids, my husband, and another friend, enjoying pizza that my host made. It was a beautiful, clear day with no real wind. We're having a great time, just out of the pool and hungry for pizza, when I suddenly felt on edge. I looked straight at the kids, about 8 and 10 or so years old, and just said, "Get in the house." We all scramble, and a second later we heard creaking, and maybe 5 seconds after it started, this big branch fell off of their pine tree onto the table where we were sitting. Thankfully, no one was hurt, besides having to pick pine needles out of our pizza. I can only assume that I subconsciously heard the branch starting to give.
If you have a story you would like to share, please share it with us in the comments. Also, subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories like this. And don't forget to turn on notifications. Take care, friends.